Thank you for having me here. I know it's a very anxious time for everyone here with struggles with the church and so on. Well, in a way, you can see my talk here is representing another sort of struggle with a different church, the Chomskyan church. Let me get on with it. Everyone should have a handout. Have you got one? It will really help to keep track of what's going on. So, introduction. The received Chomskyan view is that a grammar is about a mental organ, the language faculty. Or putting this in a less charged form, we could say that a grammar is about a speaker's linguistic competence. That's the subject, what it's talking about. So on this view, linguistics is clearly part of psychology. You got handouts? Yeah, good. Linguistics is clearly, on this view, part of psychology. So I call this the psychological conception of grammars. My book, Ignorance of Language, which came out in 2006, starts by arguing that this psychological conception is wrong, and instead I urge what I call the linguistic conception. And the linguistic conception, according to the linguistic conception, a grammar is about a non-psychological realm of linguistic expressions, physical entities forming symbolic or representational systems. That's on the handout, what I just said. That's the linguistic conception of grammars. The linguistic conception, indeed my book as a whole, has come in for a lot of criticism, some of it extremely harsh from Chomskyans. The present paper is a shortened version of a longer one, which is stimulated particularly by the criticisms of John Collins and Georges Perret. In my paper here, I aim to strengthen the case for the linguistic conception. And I'm going to start with a sketch. There's a whole chapter in the book devoted to presenting this case. I'm just going to give a brief sketch of the argument for the linguistic conception. So that's section 2. The argument rests on the application of 3 quite general distinctions to the case of humans and their language. So there's quite general distinctions, nothing, and then I apply them to language. And the distinctions are on the handout. 1, distinguish the theory of competence from the theory of its outputs, products, or inputs. And for convenience in this discussion, I'm only going to think about the outputs, products. I'm not going to be talking about the inputs. 2, distinguish the structure rules governing the outputs of a competence from the processing rules governing the exercise of the competence. 3, distinguish the respecting of structure rules by processing rules from the inclusion of structure rules among processing rules. Now, in the book, I give several illustrations of these distinctions. Some involving horseshoes, some involving chess, some involving logic and logic machines. But my favorite illustration of these distinctions comes from the bee, the honeybee, and its waggle dance. Do people know about the bee and its waggle dance? Everyone? No? No? Well, I am presupposing a bit of knowledge, but don't worry, you'll get some picture of it as we go along. So my favorite illustration is the bee and its waggle dance. And the waggle dance of a bee indicates the direction and distance of a food source. So look at distinction 1. It is illustrated by the difference between the bee's waggle dance, the one that indicates the direction and distance of a food source, and the theory of the bee's competence to produce the dance. So on the one hand, you have the theory of the dance, the symbolic system, which is the dance, which indicates where the food is, how far away. On the one hand, you have that, and on the other hand, you have the theory of the bee's competence to produce those dances. That's an illustration of distinction 1. Distinction 2 is illustrated by the difference between the structure rules of the dance, a representational system discovered by Carl von Frisch. Carl von Frisch worked for about 30 or 40 years to figure out, to understand the symbolic system, which is the bee's dance, and he won a Nobel Prize for this study. Distinction 2 illustrates the difference between, is illustrated by the difference between the structure rules of the bee's dance, discovered by von Frisch, and the largely unknown processing rules by which the bees produce the dance. Von Frisch discovered the nature of this symbolic system produced by the bees. He didn't discover anything significant about the bee's competence to produce that dance. In fact, to this very day, no one knows very much about how the bee manages to do this. Distinction 3 introduces my technical term respect. The word respect here is a technical term. It shouldn't be understood as just like the ordinary English word respect. The bee's state of competence and the embodied processing rules that constitute it must, as I say, respect the structure rules of the dance, in that they're apt to produce dances that are governed by those rules. Again, have a look on the handout. What I just said is there on the handout. If you haven't got a handout, please get one, because you'll need it. Okay. The bee's state of competence must respect the structure rules of the dance, in that they're apt to produce dances that are governed by those rules. But this is not to say that those rules, the structure rules, are included among those processing rules. Simply on the strength of von Frisch's theory, we know this minimal proposition about any competent bee, that there is something, we know not what, within the bee that respects the structure rules that von Frisch discovered. What we don't know is what there is in the bee that does this job. As I said a moment ago, no one to this day does know that. To move beyond the minimal claim about the bee's competence and discover the way in which the bee's competence respects the structure rules of the dance, we need evidence beyond anything discovered by von Frisch. We need evidence about the bee's psychology. A theory of competence, a theory of a competence, and a theory of its outputs are different. But it follows from this discussion that they must both meet what I call in the book the respect constraint. It's on the handout. A theory of a competence must posit processing rules that respect the structure rules of the outputs, and a theory of the outputs must posit structure rules that are respected by the competence and its processing rules. Okay, so that's a sketch of an argument for these three distinctions, quite general distinctions. And the first premise then of my argument for the linguistic conception of grammars is premise A on the handout. There are the general distinctions 1 to 3. Those are real distinctions. I then turn to linguistics and premise B. These distinctions apply to humans and their languages. Let me say why. Just as the theory of the representational system, that is the bee's dance, is one thing, the theory of the bee's competence to produce the dance another, so also is the theory of the representational system that is a human language one thing, the theory of the speaker's competence to produce it another. We need a theory analogous to von Frisch's theory to explain the nature of the human representational theory system. We need a theory which will, of course, be even more interesting than von Frisch. So just as we needed a theory of the bee's representational system, which was discovered by von Frisch, we need a theory of our representational system. Two, how would such a theory of the representational system, our representational system, how would such a theory help with a theory of competence in the language? It would tell us that there is something we know not what within any competent speaker that respects the structure rules it describes, the theory describes. That's the respect constraint. This is the minimal position on psychological reality that in the book I later call M. But the theory of the language provides nothing more about the mind than M. It does not tell us what there is in the speaker that does the respecting. In particular, we don't know whether any of the theory's rules that are embodied some way or other in the mind, we don't know whether any of the theory's rules are embodied some way or other in the mind, and so also part of the psychological reality that produces language. That is, if our theory of the language is good, it tells us about this representational system just the same way that von Frisch told us about the representational system of the bees. But that theory of the language doesn't tell us anything about the competence of humans to produce this language beyond the minimal M. No more than von Frisch's theory tells us about the competence of the bee's language. We know a lot about the bee's language. We know almost nothing about the bee's competence. In order to find out more about the competence than the minimal M, we need further psychological evidence of actual processing in humans. Finally, in my argument, I argue that a grammar produced by linguists is a theory of the representational system that is a human language. And that brings me to C, premise C on the handout. A grammar is a theory of the nature of the system that is a language, not of the psychological reality of that language in its competent speakers, beyond the minimal M. I take the linguistic conception of grammars to be the view that a grammar is a theory of the nature of the system that constitute a language, and the psychological conception to be the view that a grammar is a theory of the psychological reality of a language in its competent speakers. It then follows trivially from C that D, the conclusion. The linguistic conception is true and the psychological one false. The truth of the grammar of a language entails that its rules govern linguistic reality, giving a rich picture of this reality. In contrast, the truth of the grammar does not entail that its rules govern the psychological reality of speakers competent in the language. And it alone gives a relatively impoverished picture of that reality. The grammar if true, gives a rich picture of the linguistic reality, it gives a very impoverished picture of the psychological reality. The only thing it tells us about the psychological reality is that the psychological reality must respect the grammar in my technical sense of the term. Let me conclude this sketch by emphasizing that the linguistic conception does not involve the absurd claim, this is also on the handout, does not involve the absurd claim that the psychological facts have nothing to do with the linguistic facts. That would be crazy. Some psychological facts cause linguistic facts. Some respect them. Some partly constitute them. Some provide evidence for them. And some make them theoretically interesting. But psychological facts are not the subject matter of grammars. The dispute is not over whether linguistics relates to psychology, but over the way it does. Strengthening the case, section 3. 3 assumptions are important to the linguistic conception. 1, there is, and these are summarized on the handout, there is a non-psychological realm of linguistic expressions, physical entities forming symbolic or representational systems. This assumption is known as realism about linguistic entities. 2, grammars give more or less true accounts of the natures of these representational systems. 3, grammars, as accounts of these natures, are theoretically interesting. Now, my focus will be, in this talk, on assumption 1, for the realism assumption. For if 1 is true, and linguistic realism holds, then it's irresistible to suppose that grammars are more or less true of that reality. And so 2 is true. So once you've established 1, 2 is pretty obvious. And if both 1 and 2 are true, then, contrary to what John Collins claims, it's fairly easy to argue for 3. And my argument in the book that concludes as follows seems to me to do the job well enough. So here's the conclusion of my argument in the book for, in effect, for assumption 3. Language is an extraordinarily effective way of making the thoughts of others accessible to us. Thoughts that otherwise would be largely inaccessible. And of making our thoughts accessible to others, often in the hope of changing their thoughts and hence their behavior. So we have a great theoretical interest in explaining the properties of linguistic expressions, including their syntactic properties, that enable the expressions to play this striking role, a striking role of expressing thoughts. So I'm not going to say any more about assumption 2 and assumption 3. I'm going to focus on assumption 1. Return to the bee. Von Frisch's hypothesis that the bee's dance is a representational system was initially not so plausible. In fact, people thought it was a bit crazy when he first came up with this idea. And even after he produced the evidence for it, the view had its skeptics. But the overwhelming consensus now is that it's true. Von Frisch's theory of the bee's dance is true. Of course, the idea that animals have representational systems to communicate with one another is familiar. Most such systems are, however, considerably less interesting than the bees, partly because they simply communicate information about the animal's own internal state. Most representational systems in animals simply convey information like, I'm frightened, I'm hungry, I want a mate, and so on. The interesting representational systems are ones that communicate information about the external world. And that's what the bees dance does. It tells the other bees which direction the food is in and how far away it is. The bees' dance in this respect is interesting, but it's not unique in nature. Other organisms use such systems. For example, Gunnarson's prairie dogs convey information about which sort of predator is threatening and about the characteristics of a particular predator of that sort. The prairie dogs, strangely enough, live out on the prairie, and they have guard. They're not really dogs, you know, that's a misname, but they're called prairie dogs. They have guards, and these guards watch out for predators. Sometimes it's a hawk, sometimes it's a coyote, sometimes it's a human, and they send warning signals to the other dogs about which sort of a predator it is, and even about which particular example of that predator it is. Like it's the coyote who likes to rush in and try and grab any prairie dog that's lying around, versus the other sort of prairie dog which likes to slink in quietly and lie doggo looking around until some prairie dog makes a mistake. Two different animals. All of this is conveyed in a message. And of course, famously, dolphins and various primates have been taught rudimentary languages based on ours. So we have lots of evidence of representational systems in nature. They're actually strangely few in a way. I mean, if you think of the vast range of species, very few of them have interesting representational systems. In hypothesizing that a certain behavior involves a symbol that represents something, we're supposing that the behavior was produced because, in some sense, it involves the symbol representing something, and it is because of what the symbol represents that other members of the species respond to the behavior as they do. That's summarized on the handout. The point is that the best explanation of some behaviors, takes them to involve representations. And in such a case, the explanation of the cause of the behavior is dependent on the explanation of the nature of the representation. But it's important to see that these explanations are distinct. Von Frisch explained the nature of the waggle dance, but nobody has yet explained the bees dancing. Wherever some of the outputs of a community of organisms form a representational system, it's appropriate to ask, in virtue of what those outputs have their representational properties. So wherever we've come to the idea that there is a representational system here, we ask, in virtue of what does this system have the particular representational properties it has? Consider the case of the bees' dance. To convey the direction, just a little bit of background. Bees, as you know, live in a hive, and the hive has a vertical side to it. And the bees, when they come back from having been to a food source, they do a dance, a waggle dance on the side, the vertical side of the hive. And that dance conveys both the direction and distance of the food. Forget distance, just focus on direction. To convey the direction of a food source, the bee varies the angle the waggling dance makes with an imaginary line running straight up and down. So if you take the hive and you just imagine a vertical line on the side of the hive, the dance is at a certain angle to that. And it varies the angle according to the direction of the food. How does that convey the information about the direction of the food? Well, listen. If you draw a line connecting the beehive and the food source, and another line connecting the hive and the spot on the horizon just beneath the sun, the angle formed by the two lines is the same as the angle of the waggling run to the imaginary vertical line. So here you've got the bee. It does its dance at a certain angle. It could be, you know, like this or like that. Suppose that we'll call that angle phi. That angle phi is the same as the angle you get by drawing a line to the food source and drawing another line to a spot underneath the sun. That angle is phi. And so that's how the message is conveyed of where the food, which direction the food is in. Pretty amazing, isn't it? All this from a bee, a mere insect. It's arguable that the bees have the most sophisticated language in nature, apart from us. What makes it the case? What makes it the case that, given the position of that spot on the horizon, what makes it the case that, given the position of the spot on the horizon beneath the sun, the particular angle of the dance represents the direction of the food source? Well, presumably, the answer must appeal to what is innate in the bee. Similarly, with the so it's all presumably innate. Similarly, with the representational systems of many birds. I'm told, however, that the appeal will sometimes be to what is partly conventional in a community of birds. And prairie dogs, their language seems to be a little bit conventional. You move from one community to another, and they have slightly different signals. And with human languages, although the appeal may be partly to what is innate, the oft-noted arbitrariness of language shows that the appeal must be largely to what is conventional in a community. So it would be bad news for my linguistic realism if there were not the conventions that this requires. And Chomsky has indeed claimed that there are few linguistic conventions, and that such conventions as there are do not have, quote, any interesting bearing on the theory of meaning or knowledge of language. Well, I've responded to this at some length, arguing that there are many conventions and that they are important in language acquisition and use. I'm not going to repeat the argument, though we could discuss it later on, of course. Now, it is clear that my initial assumption, it's true in the book, my initial presentation of the argument for the linguistic conception, I rather took the realist assumption 1 for granted. The hypothesis that a great number of the sounds and inscriptions that humans produce do constitute representational systems seemed to me much more plausible than any of the widely accepted analogous ones about animals, about mammals, birds, and bees. I embrace the common view that the human capacity to produce these extraordinarily sophisticated representational systems is central to our triumph as a species. Still, I did note the anti-realist view that sounds and inscriptions we produce are commonly thought to have linguistic properties. I noted the view that the idea that they do have these linguistic properties is rejected by some people. Some people are anti-realists, particularly Chomskyians. I describe this anti-realism, I think rather generously, as curious. And in the book, I later developed a case for realism against anti-realism. And since then, there's been quite a number of criticisms, and I've responded to quite a lot of these criticisms, to all of them, in fact. And what I'm now going to do is respond to the most recent of these, which is in a paper by Georges Ray, which is called A Defense of Follyism. In this paper, and indeed in an earlier paper which I criticized in the book, Ray defends anti-realism about linguistic entities. Now, I'm going to say some critical things about Ray's paper, but I do have to say that he deserves a lot of credit for actually trying to argue for anti-realism. Anti-realism is just taken for granted by Chomskyans. Ray set about trying to argue for it, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. Okay, so I'm on to section 4 now. What does Ray have to say to two questions that are central to my realist assumption 1? The two questions are on the handout. 1, why would anyone think that Ray introduces this word, this term, standard linguistic entities, and he abbreviates standard linguistic entities to SLEs. Why would anyone think that SLEs do not exist? Why would anyone think there aren't any linguistic entities? 2, why is it important to suppose that they do exist? Okay, so we'll consider these in turn, starting with 1. First point about this, point A. The focus of Ray's anti-realism is on phonology. Indeed, it often looks as if his whole case that there are no SLEs rests on sounds not really being phonemes. His whole case really often seems to rest on the view that sounds are not phonemes, and hence that phonemes don't exist, or at least don't exist outside the mind. Ray claims that phonemes are, quote, perceptual in existence, like Kanitsa triangles, objects that appear to be triangles but aren't really. Pause for a second. This is supposed to be a Kanitsa triangle. Now, I have absolutely no talent as an artist, and so it's a very poor attempt at a Kanitsa triangle, but you are supposed to see this as a triangle. And if you don't, it's a failure of my artistic skills. And I guess it really is pretty pathetic, isn't it, when you look at it? But anyway, it is supposed to look like a triangle. In other words, you're supposed to see this. This is an illusion. You're supposed to, you should have the illusion that that's a triangle, that it's really like that, as it were. And this is called a Kanitsa figure. I use this term perceptual inexistence. Inexistent. This is a fancy term which Ray is taking from Brentano. Brentano noticed that we can have thoughts about things that don't exist. For example, I can think that Zeus was a Greek god. Now, of course, Zeus doesn't exist. Perhaps it's a little dangerous making these religious remarks here. Well, I'm going to stick my neck out. I'm a fearless Australian, so Zeus doesn't exist, right? But nevertheless, I can have thoughts about Zeus, Brentano came up with this idea that these things like Zeus are intentional in existence. That was his phrase. Ray's idea is that the triangle here is an intentional in existence. There isn't a triangle, but you think there's a triangle, just as you might think that Zeus is a Greek god. And what your thought is about an intentional in existence. Okay. So Ray says that phonemes are intentional in existence. Yet, so far as I can see, he never produces an argument that they are mere illusions, like Kanitsa triangles. We need at least some argument that the sounds that are associated in complicated ways with a phoneme should be described anti-realistically as mere cues for the phoneme rather than realistically as various instantiations of the phoneme. So it's a well-known fact that phonemes are associated with all sorts of different sounds. What we need then is an argument that these sounds are not instances of the phoneme, but rather, say, mere cues for the phoneme or something like that. And so far as I can see, Ray never produces such an argument. I have a bit more to say about this, but I'm going to skip it. So I'm going on to point B. So point A is, where's the argument that phonemes don't exist? Right, that's point A. Point B is, all right, let's suppose that phonemes don't exist. A language that has phonemes can, and often does, have other forms. Inscriptions, Morse, hand signals, hand signs, flags, etc. English can be spoken in lots of ways apart from using sounds, in inscriptions, in flags, in hand signals, and so on. How would the inexistence of phonemes cast any doubt on other forms of the language? Ray's anti-realism is largely based on complicated facts of phonology, facts that have led to shelves of books and to a large subdivision in linguistics. These facts could hardly cast any doubt on the existence of graphemes. For example, they could hardly show that the shapes that we take to be letters of the alphabet are not really letters of the alphabet. Anti-realism about phonemes would not generalize to anything else. Is this a demonstration?
Yeah.
I feel the urge.
To go there.
I'm a 60s boy, you know, we were always demonstrating. Yeah. Okay. Ray, so that's the point. Suppose there aren't any phonemes. How does that generalize to other forms of language? Now, Ray may think otherwise. That is, he may think that this argument generalizes to graphemes because he thinks that graphemes are also perceptual illusions. So it's not only a phonemes perceptual illusions, graphemes are. He seems to think that the real alphabet is like the Kanitsa alphabet. Now, another triumph of artistic work. This is supposed to be a Kanitsa letter A. There's a Kanitsa alphabet, and this is supposed to be the letter A in that alphabet. In other words, you're supposed to see this as if it were like this. Don't tell me you think it looks like an H. I mean, that's just my trouble. Yeah. Okay. So basically what Ray's thesis is that the real alphabet, things like this, are really illusions, just like the Kanitsa alphabet is an illusion. There's no controversy that seeing this as a triangle is an illusion. Seeing this as the letter A is an illusion. But Ray is claiming that the P2 here, that's an illusion too. Kanitsa letters, like Kanitsa triangles, are plausibly taken to be illusions, but real letters are not. Consider Kanitsa triangles, over on the left there. a Konica triangle is an incomplete figure that is not really a triangle, but appears to be a triangle. There is, of course, a real figure here. There's something real here. There's these blotchy things here, right? So there's something there, but what there isn't there is a triangle. So there is a real figure with certain superficial properties which our innate perceptual system leads us to complete. We've got an incomplete something, and our perceptual system completes it so that we see the figure as a triangle even though it isn't a triangle. That's what happens with this sort of illusion. Similarly, with a Konica letter. We complete an inscription like P1, seeing it as the letter A, P2. It isn't really the letter A, but we see it as the letter A. We take an incomplete figure, and in our mind, we see it as a complete figure. Now, it's plausible to say that we see the inexistent P1 object as a... It's plausible to say that we see the existent P1 object as the inexistent P2 object. It's plausible to say, here's something that really exists, and it's plausible to say that we see it as if it were like this. But of course, this is not here. I mean, if we, right? So it's plausible to say we see an existent shape as an inexistent letter. It's plausible to say we see an existent pattern here as an inexistent triangle, a triangle that doesn't really exist. That's all plausible. But in virtue of what do we see a P2 object, whether an existent one that really has the shape of a P... This is on the handout, and it's a crucial question. In virtue of what do we see a P2 object, whether an existent one that really has the shape of a P2 object, or an inexistent one that merely appears to have that shape, as the letter A? Here's an inexistent letter A. The question here's an existent letter A. And the question I'm asking is, in virtue of what do we see either of these as the letter A? Competition's getting a bit fierce here, isn't it? Okay. What makes a P2 object, like there, what makes that a particular grapheme? And what makes it the letter A rather than, say, the letter X? An appeal to illusions is no help in answering. We need to appeal to conventions. Whereas hearing a sound as a certain phoneme may be only a little bit the result of participating in a convention, seeing a P2 object as a certain grapheme is entirely so. We see that as that grapheme we see that as a letter A entirely by convention. That is the convention for A. Now, consequence, and this convention is something, of course, we're taught in schools, often at painful length. Not in our cultures, but just think of the Japanese, for example. Learning the graphemes is a horrible, long business. A consequence of this is that any actual P2 object can actually people hear me at all, do you think? Yeah. Okay, I'll keep going. A consequence of this is that any actual P2 object is a grapheme by convention. What makes that the letter A is a convention. What makes that very shape a letter A, and what makes this Konica finger an inexistent letter A is a convention. Whoops, just about to take the train. Okay. How then, in light of that, since this is a letter A by convention, how could grapheme not exist? How could the letter A not exist? Graphemes and their analogues in other non-phonological forms of language obviously exist. Ray seems to disagree, in which case he needs a mighty powerful argument, an argument he can't find by looking to the science of phonology. So, even if the sounds of a language lack phonological properties, this would not show that the inscriptions of a language lack graphemic properties. That's the first way in which the claims about phonology do not generalize. Here's the second way. More seriously, it does not begin to show, the problems with phonology does not begin to show that these sounds and inscriptions lack syntactic and semantic properties. Even if we show that sounds, even if we go along with the problem, because of phonology, with the problem that sounds do not have phonemic properties, that doesn't show that inscriptions don't have graphemic properties. More seriously, it doesn't show that sounds and inscriptions or anything don't have syntactic or semantic properties. Why not? Well, let's suppose that phonemes are mental entities. This does not reflect on the reality of sounds, of course. Sounds are obviously out there. Now, so take any sort of phoneme. Some sorts of sounds stand in a particular relationship to this sort of phoneme. Take any phoneme you like. There are a whole lot of sorts of sounds that stand in a particular relationship to this. What relationship? Well, maybe we'll say that those sounds are apt to cause the phoneme, or perhaps they are cues for the phoneme, or perhaps we should say that the sounds seem to be, they have the appearance of being the phoneme, or whatever. Let's not argue about exactly what the relationship is. We've got all these sounds, various sorts of sounds. Take one of those sorts of sounds, and we've got a particular phoneme. And the sound stands in a particular relationship to the phoneme. Maybe it causes the phoneme. Maybe it's a cue for the phoneme. Maybe it seems to be the phoneme. Won't worry. We'll just abbreviate this relationship with the symbol R. Now think of a series of phonemes, one phoneme after another. A series of phonemes S. And think of the series that constitutes the English word cat. So I'm trying to represent there the phonemes, the series of phonemes for the English word cat. There is a convention in English of using a series of sounds that stand in this relationship R to S to represent cats. I'll say that again. There's a convention in English of using a series of sounds that stand in relation R to S to represent cats. S being a series of phonemes. As a result, these sounds really have the semantic property of representing cats and the syntactic property of being a noun. So far as semantic syntactic realism about Ray's SLEs are concerned, it makes no difference whether the regularities, so far as syntax and semantics is concerned, it makes no difference whether the regularities that lead to the conventions involve sounds that it makes no difference to realism about syntax and semantics whether the sounds are phonemes or whether the sounds capital R phonemes. You can go either way on this issue of phonology, and it will still be the case that you have the conventions for syntax and semantics. In sum, not only would the argument for anti-realism about phonemes not generalize to other forms of language, it would not generalize to syntax and semantics. There is no case for anti-realism here. How am I doing for time? All right, coming to the end. Okay. So that's concerned with question 1. Why would anyone think that SLEs do not exist? Let's now turn to why is it important to suppose, question 2, that SLEs do exist? Ray doesn't think it is important. He doesn't think it matters whether SLEs exist. He thinks that, quote, there is no explanatory reason for those properties to be instantiated in the acoustic stream. Yet surely we need to posit real SLEs to explain communication. Or so I argued in my book. Ray disagrees. So I argued, look, we need to see SLEs as real, linguistic entities as real, in order to explain communication, what's going on in communication. Ray disagrees. Here's what he says. Communication is a kind of folie à deux. It's a bit of French, English. Everyone know folie à deux, do you think? Folie à deux? Yeah. Folie à deux. French, it's a bit of French. Folie à deux. Everyone know what I mean? It's, yeah, well, it's a bit of French that's in English. Communication is a kind of folie à deux in which speakers and hearers enjoy a stable and innocuous illusion of producing and hearing SLEs that are seldom, if ever, actually produced. They are what Franz Brentano called intentional inexistence. Things that we represent and think of as out there, but which do not exist. So Ray's idea is that in communication, here, we are communicating, and I produce a sound, which according to Ray is it's not a real linguistic entity, it's any more than that's a real triangle. It's an intentional inexistence. But I have the illusion that I am producing a real linguistic entity. And Alexis, he has the illusion, as he hears me, that I have produced a real linguistic entity. So we both, poor things, we're all deluded. Him and me. That's Ray's theory. No, there is no linguistic entity, but we all think there is, just as there is no Zeus, but we all think there is. There is no Kanitsa triangle, there is no triangle, but we all think there is. Okay, that's the theory. There's an obvious problem with this theory of communication. What's the explanation of the stability of these folly illusions? How does the message understood come to match so reliably the message intended? Ray seems to leave unexplained, even miraculous, what we need a conventional language to explain. I mean, how is it that we can communicate like that? How is it that the illusions are stable? Why don't, when I speak, why don't you sometimes think I'm saying one thing, and sometimes I think you're saying another? What's the explanation of the stability of this illusion? As far as I can see, Ray doesn't answer. Well, he didn't to start off with, but then he came up with an ingenious response. He said an intentional inexistent, hence an SLE, can enter into a convention, even though it doesn't exist. So even though there is no linguistic entity there, it can sort of enter in, the sound can enter into a convention, somehow or other. Well, as noted, Ray thinks that phonemes are perceptual in existence. And he thinks that we can find conventions involving these in existence by looking to stable perceptual illusions. He thinks the illusions are stable, just like the Knitzov triangle illusion. And that's how we can explain this stability in communication. But what Ray has not shown is how we get from this allegedly stable perceptual illusions involving in existence to the syntactic and semantic conventions we need to explain his alleged folly illusion. That has not been explained. And furthermore, I've argued that any attempt to show this will collapse into linguistic realism. Any convention involving his alleged inexistence will be one involving real SLEs. Well, I have one final thought before finishing. I pointed out that scientists frequently hypothesize that a species has a representational system which its members use to communicate with each other. Bees, prairie dogs, vervet monkeys, and so on. The scientists then go on to theorize about the nature of these representations, as von Frisch did. They ask questions like, what precisely do the representations mean? Think, for example, of the studies of the dances of bees and the barks of the prairie dogs. Sometimes most notably with representational systems that we have taught to dolphins and primates, scientists suppose that symbols have their meanings partly in virtue of having a rudimentary syntax. Now, of course, any of these hypotheses that these scientists make might be wrong. Still, many of them are widely accepted. And the important thing to note is that these hypotheses, taken by these scientists, cognitive ethologists and so on, these hypotheses are all committed to analogues of what we have been calling linguistic realism. The scientists are supposing that these animals are producing behaviors that really do involve representations having semantic and sometimes syntactic properties. And a Martian scientist would surely think at least as much about our behaviors. Indeed, he would think that our representational systems are distinguished from the others in being vastly more sophisticated syntactically and semantically. What he surely would not think is that we, unlike the other animals, are failing to produce representations that affect communication. That although we are under the illusion of producing these, we are not really doing so. That whereas we have succeeded in teaching systems to primates and dolphins that have a rudimentary syntax, we have not succeeded in producing one ourselves that has a sophisticated syntax. The Martian scientists would surely not think this because it's rather preposterous. That's it.
Bueno, ahora tenemos tiempo para unas preguntas, para una ronda de preguntas.
You want some sort of connection, you want some sort of psychological theory. So why don't you leave the processing rules or the so quote-unquote internal rules aside?
Well, I don't know whether I need it. I just think it's true, that's all. I mean, I'm arguing against the Chomskyans. There's a standard form of argument in the literature proposed particularly by Chomsky, but also by others, when the issue of the psychological reality of language comes up. It's been coming up, of course, for decades. We got all these grammars, and people started asking, particularly pesky philosophers, why we should suppose that the rules and principles proposed by the grammar are psychologically real in speakers. And Chomsky had a standard response to this, which went like this. Look, in linguistics, we're coming up with theories. We have good reason to think the theories are true. Of course, very likely they're not entirely true, and so on and so forth. We have good reason to think they're true about a certain reality. The only respectable thing to do in science is to go along with this realist view that scientific theories are really true of the reality they're talking about, give or take some errors. Instrumentalism is no longer an acceptable view in science generally. It shouldn't be an acceptable view in linguistics anymore. So we should take the grammars to be more or less true of the reality that they are concerned with. And the reality, this is the key assumption, the reality they're concerned with is psychological. So of course the rules are psychologically real. We've got a grammar, it's talking about psychological reality, we suppose it's mostly true, so of course, don't keep bothering me with this psychological realism issue. It should be closed. Now, I'm trying to resist that argument by resisting that final claim that the grammars are about the psychological reality. But I don't want to overstate my case. I can't, because I would open myself. I mean, look, I get enough problem from Chomskyans when I claim truths. If I start claiming falsehoods, I'll get even more trouble. And I don't want to say that the grammar throws no light on psychological reality, because grammars do throw some light on psychological reality, just not very much. I mean, again, think of the bee's dance. We all know, since von Frisch discovered the grammar of the bee's dance, we all know that there's something in a bee. We know at least this. There's something in the bee, we don't know what, which respects the rules discovered by von Frisch. Well, I must concede that we also know just the same with grammars. We know that there's something in the speakers of a language, their competence, which respects the rules of the language discovered in the grammar. I've got to concede that because it seems to me true. I mean, that's all that's, I'm trying to just come up with what seems true.
So you would have no problem with zero morphemes or phrases or Chomskyan empty categories? That could be part of...
Yes, yeah. That could be, and I don't ever, I'm never so bold as to challenge the syntactic theories being produced here, the grammars. I mean, and in particular, I wouldn't want to challenge the idea of traces or empty categories, because in fact, actually, it seems to me to be true, you know. I mean, it seems to me, I'm not, of course, a syntactician, but the idea that there's an empty category, and John wants to swim. Seems to me very plausible. So, so no, I'm not challenging any of those claims in the grammar. I'm not even taking a stand on, I mean, as we all know, over the last few decades, generative grammars have changed shape terrifically. Standard theory, extended standard theory, and then the principles and parameters and so on, and minimalism. I'm not taking any stand. I'm saying, look, that's an issue quite apart from what I'm concerned with. I'm concerned with the issue, look, suppose any of these grammars were true. What would it show us about psychological reality? I mean, that's the general concern, a general concern that lies behind the paper I'm here delivering. So no, I don't take issue with that. I'm not being so bold or even so stupid as to challenge syntactic theory.
How, for example, other linguistic theories are also interested in the relationship between language and mind or psychological part of language, but are not generative theories. For example, I don't know, experimental linguistics or cognitive linguistics or work by grammatics.
Right. So, could you ask me your question again? What exactly you're asking me?
I would like to know what do you think about those theories which in a way are trying to describe language based on psychological concepts and models and that don't make this distinction between the real...
Right. So you're asking me about non-Chomskyan, you're asking me about other views of language which are psychological. Share Chomskyan's psychological conception, but have different sorts of grammars and so on.
Actually don't, so they have a different, they actually are not generative and they don't...
Yeah, but I didn't say anything about generative. So, well, obviously, I mean, if you've got in mind, you mentioned cognitive linguists, did you have other ones in mind, or?
Well, people, I don't know, for example, the work by Matt Shibatani trying to explain like transitive constructions based on psychological schemes.
Right. Well, look, my view, the view I've argued for today, I'm particularly aiming at Chomsky's, but it's quite general. So it goes against any psychological picture. So the cognitive linguists I'm just trying to, I have actually read some cognitive linguistics, but it's a few years back and I'm trying to remember the details. It really doesn't make any difference to my thesis, whatever they propose as their theory of language. If they think they're describing the mind, then it seems to me they're wrong. Modulo the respect constraint. I want to emphasize that I'm not claiming, as I said at the beginning, I'm not claiming that psychological facts have nothing to do with linguistic facts. I mean, that would be just absurd. So would you like to tell me, you asked me the question, do you have in mind something particular that they have to say which you think would be a difficulty for me?
Well, basically, I think that the idea beyond this kind of cognitive approach to grammar is that our traditional categories, such as, I don't know, object or phoneme or whatever, are not, are actually not, don't have psychological reality. So rather than talking about things that work very well, you are trying to describe a system that you can call a grammar, they are trying to find categories that find some sort of relation or support on psychological categories. And for example, I don't know, I'm thinking about this, talking about phonology, for example, I'm thinking about all these use-based models of language in which the rules that we use to describe phonological changes or processes are criticized because they don't think that actually when you pronounce, I don't know, cat in English with an aspiration and K without the aspiration, they don't think that you need a rule to describe why this phoneme is changing. They just think that what the speaker knows should be more similar to what he produces.
Look,
it's a radical interpretation of your respect.
Right. I'd have to look at the details, but here's my quick response. That what these guys are are talking about is really orthogonal. Their disagreements with the generativists is orthogonal to my issue. But what I'm talking about is quite independent of that. That's I can't see how it could be otherwise.
¿Hay más preguntas?
Sorry.
Okay.
Well, look, just one for... I mean, if you're going to explain language change, phonological, semantic, or whatever, you're surely going to have to do it in terms of psychological facts. So, I mean, that's not an issue. I mean, that's not at odds with what I'm claiming. I mean, I'm simply claiming that grammars are about idealized versions of the sorts of sounds I am now producing, the sorts of inscriptions written on the page here. That's what grammars are about. That's really my message. Yeah.
So Chomsky's approach to language has focused, grosso modo, mostly on the three aspects: a theory of grammars, a theory of language, and more recently, the incorporation of language in a theory of mind.
Right.
And I wonder if your critics about the conception of grammars can expand or go through the other two points of view, the theory of language and the theory of language and mind.
I don't see, why not? Do you see any particular problem? I mean, my book starts with a longer version of the sort of stuff I've been talking about here, arguing for the linguistic conception, though I didn't call it that in the book. The rest of the book is concerned with the psychological issue you just raised. That is, my book is largely devoted to figuring out, look at all the evidence, in light of that evidence, what can we now conclude about the place of language in the mind? That's a psychological issue. That's what, and I don't, what I'm saying here simply eliminates one sort of, what I think rather, dare I say, rather crude way of solving this problem, which is to take grammars to be about the mind. Then, of course, you can automatically conclude. That's what I refer to as the fast and dirty route to the psychological reality. So if you don't take that, then it becomes a question of, all right, what is there in the mind that is responsible for this? Here is this external product, the language, the representational system. Competent speakers produce it, produce instances of it. Okay, what does that competence consist in? That issue is just as live and has to be confronted. So I don't have any trouble. I mean, as I said, that's what I'm trying to do. So I take the psychological issue very, very seriously, and I'm trying to set out a constraint on how we approach it, which is, the constraint is that we've got to come up with some account of what's going on within us, that it respects the structure rules discovered by the grammar, which are rules of this external, outside the mind, representational system.
As I understand, speakers' linguistic competence is a state of the mind, and when Chomsky approached language, tried to explain language, he's trying to explain also state of the mind, but with no knowledge and no prior experience, and with no prior risk. That's it. And maybe a part of my question was if your psychological, what you call psychological approach, is including also computational representational approach to language that has been eroded in the recent years, about language being just merely an operation, a computational operation, and that is included or inbuilt in our body, in the brain. I wonder if your conception of psychological approach is including that new view of language in Chomsky's view.
I'm going to have to get you to say a bit more. I didn't really quite follow this. I mean, you're talking of computational linguistics, are you?
No, not really. Not really. There is a distinction that Chomsky has made about a faculty of language in a broad sense and in a narrow sense.
Right.
In a narrow sense, a faculty of language is just an operation, a computational operation called merge, that it's basically an operation that put together different syntactic objects and creates a new syntactic object. And the faculty of language in a broad sense is includes all the other mechanisms that are involved in linguistics or in language computation or in language knowledge.
Right. Well, you see, it follows from my thesis here that I mean, you're talking about minimalism here. Yeah, right. It follows from my thesis that an awful lot of what is being said here, though not everything, because a lot of it is not actually stating grammars, but talking about grammars. An awful lot of what is being said here is being wrongly described as characterizing the language faculty. I mean, that's a consequence, really. I mean, I think a lot of an awful. I mean, I think that what grammars are doing are characterizing relations, syntactic relations in representational systems. not the language faculty. So, I mean, that is the, I guess, a fairly radical conclusion of my view. But I mean, it may seem radical to say this, but you know, in a way, if you just stand back, I mean, Chomsky is such an enormously powerful thinker and also such an enormously powerful exponent in his view that it swayed a lot of people. But if you actually stand back from it, I mean, there's something very weird about this. I mean, just think of my final remarks. I mean, bees have a language? No one thinks that von Frisch was describing the competence of the bee. Slobodchikov spent 30 years of his life out in the prairies videoing prairie dogs. And he's come up with his theory as to what the language of the prairie dogs. Nobody supposes that they don't have a language. Herman and his co-workers have worked diligently with dolphins in captivity and taught them remarkable languages, not nearly as sophisticated as English, but sort of like crude languages, including, and they've done something rather stunning. They've taught dolphins an OSV language, object, subject, verb language, of which there is, I think, no example in nature. They did this in order to deal with critics, behaviorist critics. So here we've got serious scientific researchers discovering languages in nature, teaching languages in nature, and all of them suppose realism. They all suppose that what they're doing, they're describing, are the actual symbolic systems. Of course, in primatology, a number of people have, of course, taught primates languages. And there's lots of argument, of course, as to exactly what the nature of these languages are that they taught. But no one doubts that there is a language and it's out there. And all I'm saying is, yeah, and we've got one too. And it's sort of preposterous to say we don't. It's sort of preposterous to say that what's on the page there does not have the syntactic and semantic properties of, more or less, described in grammars. And it's preposterous to say that what I am now producing does not have those. So I think Chomsky has just led everyone astray. Badly astray. I know it's puts me at great risk of my life, but that's what I think. Yeah, that's what I'm arguing. And I have scars all over my body to reflect the consequences of saying anything like this. But that is what I'm arguing. So I just think all that stuff about the language faculties. I think in my book, having argued for this, as I said, I then spend the rest of the book trying to figure out what actually, given the evidence we know about the psychology of the place of language in the mind, and my conclusion is very little. That's the state of knowledge. What's going on in us? I remarked earlier that we have no idea what's going on in the bee that enables it. I mean, just think of what we've got to try and explain with the bee. We've got to try and explain, first of all, the bee has been off to a food source and it comes back. It's got to have some sort of, presumably, representation of how far away the source is, which direction it is. It's then got to notice where the spot under the sun is from the hive, and it's got to somehow compute all that information to yield a dance which is at the right angle to the no one knows how the bee does, don't have the faintest idea. Well, I would suggest that we're actually not much wiser about what's, I mean, there are these incredibly ingenious, I'm an enormous admirer of psycholinguistics. I think they're just doing wonderful work. But what actually, despite all this wonderful work, what do we actually know about the place of language in the mind? It seems to me very little. We've got some wonderful sort of ideas, but actually pinning it down is incredibly difficult. So far as I can see, I spent a lot of time reading this stuff, and it seemed to me that they were wonderfully, or psycholinguists are wonderfully modest about how little we know. So I think we don't know much about the language faculty. I don't even think we know there is a language faculty. Let me just say that, right? I think this is just an extraordinarily bold assumption on very little evidence. Well, not very little evidence, but certainly not long way from conclusive evidence. I mean, what actually, if you stand back, what's the evidence there is a language faculty? Now, of course, the cognitive linguists, they don't think there's a language faculty. I don't go along with their particular argument, but I mean, they're asking a good question. I mean, why suppose there is a language faculty? Now, I'm not confident there isn't a language faculty. I just think it's not nearly as obvious as Chomskyan seems to suppose it is. I mean, if you just look at the evidence. I mean, even the brute physical evidence is far from obvious. You know, there's been since the 19th century, there's been the assumption that there was the popular assumption that, you know, we could find the actual place of language in the mind. The Broca and what's the other name, area, and so on and so on. But, you know, as people have worked away at trying to establish that thesis, it's got weaker and weaker. And now the people who actually do the neuro stuff don't seem to feel at all confident they know where to place language in the mind. So we haven't even got that. I mean, if you could actually find an area of the mind that was sort of, this is where linguistic competence is, that would be some sort of evidence that we found the language faculty. But when you actually find that language is sort of diffuse all over the bloody brain, that doesn't help. Yeah. So I'm dubious about even the existence of the language faculty. I just think what we need to speculate, hypothesize about the mind, is we need evidence about the mind. We don't need grammars. Grammars don't tell us any more about the mind than von Frisch told us about the inner workings of the bee. We need a hell lot of psychology. And when people try and do the psychology, as of course the psycholinguists are doing with a wonderful ingenuity, they find it's very hard. Yeah.
Tenemos 5 minutos para una pregunta más. Omar.
Could you speak up just a bit? Sorry.
The first one is about your views on inexistence.
Oh, yes.
The second one is about your views of respect.
Oh, yes.
Well, the first one is, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, that for you inexistence means that something does not exist.
Right.
But I haven't read yet the article from this from Ray.
No, right.
But I haven't read that.
You have read Brentano?
Yes.
Yes, right.
So, for Brentano, inexistence does not mean that something does not exist. Inexistence means that something exists in the mind. So, it's an in German, it's inexistence. It's inexistence. So, I think,
okay.
according to this, I think that maybe what Ray is trying to do here is to drag grammar back to the psychological realm.
Yes, you're right. Look, you, I'm sure, are a much better scholar of Brentano than I am, and I'm quite happy to go along with everything you said, right, on that. So I was not meaning to take any real stand on Brentano's scholarship. And I do think that what you described as Brentano's view catches the sort of view that Ray is pushing pretty well. Yeah. So Ray thinks that this is perhaps a little crude a way to capture his view, but he thinks that standard linguistic entities are not out there in the world, they're in the mind. Yeah. And so I think I don't have any quarrel with what you say.
It would be to use straightforward anti-realism, but something like an in-realism.
Yeah, what you describe as an anti-realist, to say
for what you read in your article, he's trying to attack the gap that you're living between linguistic realm and psychological realm. He's trying to
bring them together. Yeah. And that's right. Yeah. Well, I want to say that the linguistic realm is distinct from the psychological. Yes, you're right. And he wants to reject that. Yeah.
And that leads me to my second question. It's about the use of respect.
Right.
Because I don't know exactly what has to respect one. Is one structure to the other? I mean, the linguistic structure about the linguistic things, and the psychological one.
Right.
Or the theories about one another. I will put it in this way. I make a little picture. I don't know if I will be just with your ideas, but I try to understand it this way.
Right.
It's like if we had a group of kids that have their mente, and they know the rules about using the gamepad.
Right.
So they know that if every time they press B, Mario's gonna jump.
Right.
They don't know anything about the internal functions of the mente.
Right.
So I try to understand that respect ideas in the sense that if one kid is trying to explain what is happening in the mechanism in that intelligence they have,
right.
His description, his theory about what is happening in their in the competence,
right.
Has to respect the rule of B means jump.
Right.
But it's the respect in this level is running in the theory level. It's my theory about what is happening.
Yes, master.
Has to respect
Right.
about the other.
Right.
Not what is
Okay.
the other. So
okay.
The question is about how does relate the first distinction that you make between the competence and the output input,
right.
and the second distinction between the structural rules of the output and the processing rules of the excellence of the competence. How these two distinctions relate.
Right. Respecting is not a relationship between theories, it's a relationship between what theories are about, right? So respecting, I just read from my own handout here, right? I say, the B state of competence, that's a state, we're not talking theories. The B state of competence, and for that matter the processing rules that constitute it, must respect the structure rules of the dance. So the dance has certain properties discovered by von Frisch in virtue of being governed by certain structure rules. So there are properties of the dance, there's properties of the internal state, and the properties of the internal state, the B's competence, must respect the structure rule properties of the of the language discovered by von Frisch. So, respect, my technical term, is capturing a relationship between the competence and the language. Nothing to do with theories. However, following on from that relationship, I come up with a theoretical constraint, which I call the respect constraint. It follows from, the respect constraint follows from what I've just said about the respect relationship. And the respect constraint says a theory of a competence must posit processing rules that respect the structure rules of the output. And a theory of the outputs must posit structure rules that are respected by the competence and its processing rule. So the basic relationship captured by respect is between a psychological state and a linguistic state, let's say. And as a result of that, it imposes a constraint on theories, which I call the respect constraint. Is that clearing up what you asked? Sorry, of the which?
Oh, I will extend my example
of the
example because what grammar would be describing in that parallel would be that one model relates to one action in the screen, but an explanation that goes around the components. Electronic components,
right,
could add some more information from the description that is still initially, that in the first place was looking at the level of ground. So there is no gap between what can be let's say this way, external and the internal functioning of the game. Everything is one whole thing. And
look, I'm having a lot of trouble with the game analogy. You see, the trouble with analogies is one has to see the analogy. And my technical term, respect, has its role when we're dealing with a competence. Now, what in your I don't see what is the competence here? What's the competence?
Competence is not another realm. It's not something separated, but could be integrated to the first initial description of what is happening in the surface, to say it this way.
What are we talking about? I'm sorry, but what actually are we talking about? Are we talking about your game?
Or the bees.
Or
the bees.
The bees.
Maybe,
right. So say it again. We're talking about the bees.
And the psychological explanation.
Yes.
Be part and not something apart from the phenomenon that is going to be explained.
Well, I don't think that the psychological explanation of the bees is apart from what von Frisch discovered, because I have the respect relationship. So, I'm not seeing what is your worry? I mean, discuss it with the bees. What's your worry with the bees?
That in your explanation, in your defense of the independence of grammar from psychology,
yes,
what in the bees is the difference between what this author has already described and what is left to be described in terms of the competence of the bees to do that.
right.
You're trying to separate.
Yes,
Yeah.
but not separate them so they don't have any relationship.
No, yeah, but they say that grammar is independent from the competence. Isn't that what you're trying to say?
No, because I think you see, you're putting words into my mouth that I don't actually utter. I mean, I'm not saying that the grammar is independent of a theory of competence. Grammar is a theory of the language. I'm not saying that a grammar is independent of the theory of competence. I'm saying they're related by the respect constraint. So they're not independent. I am saying that a grammar, and I did say actually, a grammar provides a very impoverished picture of the psychological reality. I didn't say it provides no picture of the psychological reality. Similarly, von Frisch provided an impoverished picture of the psychological reality of the bee, because he came up with a theory of the bee's language, and we can therefore conclude that any competent bee, within any competent bee, is something we know not what, which respects that language. And that's not nothing we learned from von Frisch. In fact, let me put it to you another way. If you're investigating any competence, whether it's a linguistic competence or a sporting competence or whatever, the first thing you have to do is characterize the outputs of the competence. Characterize what this is a competence to do. Characterize that, then you do, it's against the background of that you set about doing the psychology. It seems to me the same in, for example, psycholinguistics. You couldn't do any interesting psycholinguistics if you didn't have any theory of the language that is being processed. So you have a theory of the language being processed, and that is the guiding idea for you. What you're now trying to do in psycholinguistics is figure out what's going on in this organism that respects what we now know about the language. That is, so I see them as related, but only by this respect. I have the feeling I'm not getting through here.
Bueno, ahora sí nos hemos pasado del tiempo. En nombre de Estudios Generales Letras y del Grupo de Investigación Mente y Lenguaje, les damos las gracias a ustedes por participar y por supuesto al profesor Devitt por compartir su conocimiento con nosotros. Thank you very much.
Thank you.